Hi, I'm Colton, and I'm going to be discussing why nutrition and specifically post-exercise nutritional replenishment is specifically important for you, collegiate men's soccer players, in order to really maximize your potential performance and athletic ability, as well as enhancing and making sure that you're recovering correctly so you can come back tomorrow and days and days and days. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction, or for some of you, perhaps reintroduction of the topics that I'm going to be covering today before I jump into kind of the more specific and nitty-gritty details of how all this is going to pertain to your sport. All right, so the three topics that I'm going to be covering today are calories, carbohydrates, and hydration status. Now, all this is going to have to do with what it is you're taking in after a training session, or maybe even a game or event or a match, I think it is in soccer. So calories are, in short and simplest terms, energy. Everything that our body does throughout the day requires energy. Me lifting my hand or you running 40 miles, it takes energy. You, as athletes, require typically a little more energy than the average person does. In soccer, takes both aerobic and anaerobic conditioning, and that's going to require quite a few calories. So it is really important that you get the amount of calories that you need in order to sustain and continue working to your highest potential. Calories come in four different forms: fat, carbohydrates, protein, and technically alcohol. I'm going to touch on that just a little bit later. Of particular interest, carbs. More specifically and more appropriately, carbohydrates is our next topic, and it's the macronutrient, or the nutrient between fat, protein, carbohydrates, and alcohol that I'm going to be talking about to you today. So carbohydrates are, we as humans, most readily available and preferred source of energy. And as athletes, you're really looking for kind of that preferred, most easily utilized source of energy. Because these carbohydrates are so easily utilized, like I said, they're the easiest source for you as athletes and the simplest source to kind of store up, fuel up on before, during, and after your training session. And carbohydrates are found in abundant in whole grains, like oatmeal, bread, wheat products, rice, vegetables, and fruits, as well as your sports drinks, which specifically for you as athletes, we will be talking about a little more specific. We're also going to be talking about hydration, which can be overlooked, especially when you're talking about your post-exercise hydration status. Typically, I think we're pretty good about hydrating during events. It's just easy. You come to the bench, you come during a timeout, you take a quick swig. But after, you do need to replenish those that hydration status, and make sure that you balance out your hydration level. So we're going to be touching on that as well. So our first main point concerns calories. So calories, as I mentioned, are our source of energy. Now, athletes in particular, as I mentioned before, have a higher need for calories because of your increased, typically fairly high level of physical activity. And for now, I'm going to be focusing on calories in a broad sense, and I'm going to delve more deeply into carbohydrates specifically later on. As college soccer players, it's probably pretty fair to say that your training sessions have a healthy mix of aerobic and anaerobic conditioning. This, of course, is in order to condition you for what a typical 90-minute soccer match is going to look and feel like. There's lots of sprinting to get to balls. If you're the keeper, diving for the ball. There's also a fair bit of, jogging and treading water, whatever the soccer version of that is, so there is a mix of aerobic and anaerobic spread throughout. For this reason, you as soccer players are burning probably a considerable amount of energy during your matches. So keeping this in mind, you are going to require more calories in order for you to perform at your very best. And the nutrition that you take in immediately following, or at least relatively soon following, your training session or match could very well have a profound implication on your recovery and how you are able to come back the next day and train just as hard. So let's talk quality a little bit before we talk quantity. Does it matter where these calories come from? The short answer is yes, it does matter where these calories come from. The quality of your calories you consume today could have an effect on how you perform tomorrow. It stands to reason that if your calorie intake is inadequate, you will not have the necessary energy required to make a full recovery and then come back tomorrow and perform just as well. So then where should these calories come from? A generous amount of these calories should be coming from carbohydrates, which again, I'll be talking more in depth later. You should probably be eating a quality protein as well after your session, which could include something like lean meats, fish, or maybe even a protein supplement if convenience is a big factor for you. An easy guideline to remember is the 3-to-1 ratio, and that is 3 parts carbohydrates to 1 part protein. And basically this ratio just helps to encourage a healthy recovery meal post-exercise. And this 3-to-1 guideline doesn't have to be spot on. It can fluctuate slightly, but it's at least a good place to start. So I talked a little bit about carbohydrates and proteins, but what about your dietary fats? Well, the short answer to this is you shouldn't put too much focus and or stress into where you're getting or how much fat you're getting. As athletes, you should be focusing primarily on carbohydrates, secondarily on proteins, and probably just filling in the rest of your caloric requirements with these fats. If you're in a sport like an ultra endurance sport, and soccer potentially could fall into a category just short of this, and you require a lot of calories if you're doing 2-a-days or something of the sort, fats are a very caloric dense nutrient. So in that sense, they could be useful to getting your total calories. But you should be putting most of your emphasis, since we're talking specifically about post-workout recovery, into your carbohydrates and proteins. So while it may seem silly, I can't not mention that alcohol should not be used as a reliable post-exercise energy source. Yes, it is energy dense, but it could hinder your recovery and it could hamper your hydration status. So best idea is to just stay away from alcohol post-workout. So let's talk carbohydrates again. Again, they're your most reliable and preferred source of energy, but that's not the whole reason why carbohydrates are so important. See, your body has an efficient method for storing these carbohydrates, that being in the form of glycogen in your muscle and liver. And your body's stores of glycogen is really what we're going to be putting an emphasis on in regards to our post-workout recovery. So even if you're keeping up with your carbohydrate fueling during your workout session or your match, that more than likely being in the form of like a sports drink, you will probably still be depleted of your glycogen stores post-workout. So remember, these stores are your body's source of energy. So replenishing them immediately following your exercise is going to affect how you can come back tomorrow and compete or perform again. Depending on what point of the competitive season you're in, your carbohydrate needs may be even greater. For example, if you're conditioning or weight training in the morning, and then you have, an arbitrary amount of time before you then go back to the field and do skills training, which as soccer players is still going to require quite a bit of running, sprinting, pivoting, physical stuff. Your glycogen replenishment is extremely important in that little gap. So in simple terms, you don't want to tire yourself out in the morning and then not recover properly enough when you come back later for your skills training. If you're exercising twice a day, the general rule is you're going to need about 1 gram of carbohydrate for every kilogram of body weight every hour between when you're done with the first training session and you start the next one. And I wrote on your handout little equations to guide you in this regard. All right, we've talked a little bit about quantity, so now let's talk a little bit more about the quality of these carbohydrates. For example, brown rice, whole grain products have a reputation for being the quote-unquote healthier products, but you as athletes may benefit from white rice, white breads, more so than the whole grain products. This is because the whole grains are typically digested a little slower, whereas the white bread is digested a little more quickly. And the whole grains have a little bit more fiber, which could lead to some gut discomfort, which is not something that you want during your match. And again, this is if we're doing 2-a-days and we're replenishing before the next one. If you're talking about what you're doing after your final exercise of the day, the white breads and grains can still probably benefit you a little bit more, but we're going to be a little bit less picky on if you have brown rice for that meal. So another useful source of these carbohydrates, particularly in between sessions, is going to be sports drinks. Many of these are specifically formulated for athletes, and typically you think of it as something you drink during a workout, but it can be equally useful post-workout. It's fast digesting carbohydrates, so you're going to get those carbohydrates quickly, and it has an added benefit of replenishing electrolytes, which I'm actually going to be talking about a little more in depth later. So if your post-workout meal is rich in grains like bread, rice, pasta is easy, and has a lean protein, you're probably going to be set. What if you have a night class and convenience is kind of a problem for you? The chocolate milk is a really good option. It has that magical 3-to-1 ratio that we mentioned earlier. There are supplements out there. If you can make it whole food, though, that really should be your preference. And I actually wrote some examples of meals and convenience foods on your handout. So a lot of times hydration kind of takes a back seat when we're talking about post-exercise replenishment. But it's definitely something we need to consider after an intense training session. While it's hopefully likely, again, that you're keeping up with your hydration during your session, it's pretty easy to forget about after your exercise. That being said, we are looking to stabilize your hydration levels. It's a state called euhydration. We don't want to overhydrate, so you don't need to chug a gallon of water. If you overhydrate, you could potentially actually end up losing water, in your post-exercise continuation of sweat or excessive urination. And this could lead to lower sodium levels, and we're going to talk about electrolytes in a little bit. So the equation that I wrote for you in your handout, while accurate, is not necessarily convenient. But the equation goes, for every kilogram lost during exercise, supposedly due to water loss, you should replace it with 1.25 to 1.5 liters of fluid. This is not always possible. You're not always going to remember to weigh yourself before and after. If it's not possible, then it's best to just ensure that you're drinking your fluids consistently after your session. Here once again, sports drinks are particularly useful as an athletic aid for hydration and electrolyte replenishment. Sodium content can help replenish any sodium lost during your session, and this dietary sodium helps to retain your ingested fluids, which may help to maintain and or restabilize your hydration levels. And since these sports drinks are already useful for, as I previously said, for carbohydrate replenishment, it's sort of a 2 birds with 1 stone kind of thing. Alcohol has a negative effect on your hydration levels. Don't do it. So I hope you at least have a little better understanding about how post-exercise replenishment works and is really beneficial for you to take seriously. Your adequate calorie intake, carbohydrate intake, and hydration leveling off. It could be the difference between you working to the best of your ability and really maximizing your performance day in and day out, and you eventually crash. Come back better. Let your post-workout nutrition be a weapon, not a liability. Thanks.